Obese sisters sold like cattle. Mountain man who bought them said, "I'll give you a home." On a dusty frontier street, a drunken father drags his own daughters onto the auction block, shouting for whiskey while the crowd jeers. The church bell tolls, the sheriff turns away, and two frightened women stand ready to be sold like livestock. Then, out of the silence, boots strike the dirt. A scarred mountain man steps forward, tossing down gold. The crowd gasps as his voice cuts through the shame. "You're not cattle. You're women of worth." But the shack he takes them to is crumbling. The law is against them, and a railroad agent waits with papers to tear it all down. As fever strikes one sister and deputies drag him to jail, a hidden truth rises from the past. Records and coins that could save them all. In a land ruled by greed and mockery, can a broken man and two forgotten women fight for dignity, family, and faith? Or will the West swallow them whole? Every time I see your comments, I'm reminded how stories connect us across distances, backgrounds, and hearts. If values like respect, courage, and compassion still guide you, then you're part of this story too. The autumn wind whistled through the livestock pens, carrying the acrid smell of dust and manure across the Colorado rail town. Wooden wheels creaked as wagons lined up for the afternoon auction, their drivers calling greetings and sharing news of recent cattle prices. But today, something was different. Something wrong. Clara Haskins kept her eyes fixed on her worn boots, unable to meet the cruel stares of the gathering crowd. Beside her, her younger sister Bess trembled, her lips moving in silent prayer. The auction platform's rough boards pressed against their knees where they knelt, displayed like chattel for sale. Their father, Jedediah Haskins, swayed drunkenly at the edge of the platform. His bloodshot eyes gleamed with malice as he grabbed the auctioneer's arm. "Go on then. Sell 'em like the rest of the stock." The whiskey on his breath carried even to where his daughters huddled. The auctioneer, Tom Wilson, twisted his felt hat in his hands. "Now, Jed, this ain't right and you know it. These are your flesh and blood." "Ain't no use to me," Jedediah spat. "Can't work like men, eat more than horses. Time someone else fed them." He kicked at the platform near Clara's knee, making her flinch. The crowd pressed closer, their jeers growing bolder. "Looks like you're selling by the pound today, Jed," someone called out. Laughter rippled through the onlookers. Bess's quiet singing grew just loud enough for Clara to hear. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound." Her sister's familiar comfort and hymns brought tears to Clara's eyes. The auctioneer cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Well, folks, seems we have an unusual offering today." He glanced apologetically at the sisters. Two capable women, raised proper despite their current circumstances. "I'll trade you a jug of rye," shouted a voice from the crowd. More laughter followed. "Got a mule's harness, barely used," called another. Clara felt her cheeks burn with shame. She'd known hunger and mockery before, but nothing like this public humiliation. She reached for Bess's hand, finding it cold and trembling. $5, someone called out. $3 and a winter coat. The cruel offers continued, each one driving the sisters lower, their shoulders hunched against the verbal assault. Jedediah grinned, already counting his whiskey money. Then a deep voice cut through the noise like a knife through butter. "That's enough." The crowd parted, revealing a tall figure at its edge. Ezekiel Boone stood there, his buckskin jacket dusty from the trail, a Winchester rifle cradled in one arm. His weathered face was hard as granite beneath his broad-brimmed hat. The laughter died away. Even drunk, Jedediah took a step back. Everyone knew Boone's reputation from his days as a Union scout, a man who dealt fair but brooked no nonsense. Ezekiel's boots thudded heavily on the wooden steps as he mounted the platform. He looked down at the kneeling sisters, his expression softening slightly. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out a leather pouch. 20 gold eagles, he said, dropping the pouch at Jedediah's feet. The coin spilled out, glinting in the autumn sunlight. "That's $400, more than fair price for your homestead and stock if you had any." A murmur ran through the crowd. That was serious money in these parts. Ezekiel turned to face the onlookers, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent auction yard. "These women aren't cattle. They're daughters of Eve, made in God's image, same as any here. His hand rested meaningfully on his rifle. They deserve respect and a proper home. I aim to provide both. He turned to Clara and Bess, his voice gentling. That is, if you're willing. I've got a place up in the hills. It's rough living, but it's honest. You'll have a roof over your heads and no man'll trouble you there. Clara looked up at last, searching the mountain man's face. She saw no mockery there, no cruel intentions, just straightforward dignity and perhaps a hint of lonely understanding in his eyes. Bess's hymn had fallen silent. She squeezed Clara's hand, a question in the gesture. Clara drew a deep breath. They had no real choice. Their father would only try this again if they refused. Yet something in Ezekiel's manner suggested this wasn't just charity or impulse. He was offering them more than shelter. He was offering them their dignity back. We accept your kindness, Mr. Boone, Clara said, her voice steady despite her pounding heart. Ezekiel nodded once, then turned back to Jedediah. Sign a bill of sale, now. The auctioneer hurriedly produced paper and pencil. Jedediah scrawled his mark, already reaching for the gold coins with shaking hands. The law will know of this transaction, Ezekiel continued, his tone steel-edged. These women are under my protection now. Anyone thinking to make trouble should remember that. The crowd began to disperse, shame replacing their earlier cruelty as Ezekiel helped the sisters to their feet. He treated them with careful courtesy, steadying them but not presuming to touch them more than necessary. My wagon's over yonder, he said, gesturing to a sturdy vehicle at the edge of the yard. Got some blankets in the back to make you comfortable. It's a fair ride up to the cabin. As they walked away from the auction platform, Clara heard Bess resume her hymn, voice stronger now. Was blind, but now I see. The dust settled behind them as Ezekiel's wagon rolled out of town, bearing the sisters toward their new life in the Colorado hills. They left behind the jeering crowd, their drunken father, and the shame of that autumn afternoon. Ahead lay uncertainty, but also hope, and the promise of a home where they would be valued for more than their appearance or appetites. The afternoon sun cast long shadows as they traveled, and Clara noticed how Ezekiel kept a watchful eye on the trail ahead, while giving the sisters space to collect themselves. This strange, quiet man had done more than save them from humiliation. He had restored their humanity with a few simple words and actions. Bess leaned against Clara's shoulder, her hymn fading to hummed notes. The wagon wheels creaked a steady rhythm as they headed toward the mountains, their shapes dark against the fading sky. It wasn't the future either sister had imagined, but it was a future with dignity, and perhaps that was worth more than all the gold eagles in Ezekiel's pouch. The crowd dispersed in hushed whispers, their earlier cruelty replaced by stunned silence. Ezekiel Boone stood like a weathered oak beside the sisters, his presence keeping the last few gawkers at bay. His calloused hand gestured toward his wagon, parked at the edge of the auction yard. This way, he said quietly. Watch your step on these boards. Clara kept her arm around Bess's shoulders as they made their way down from the platform. Her younger sister still trembled, though her hymn singing had faded to whispered prayers. The wooden steps creaked under their feet, and Clara fought to keep her balance, conscious of every eye still watching them. Ezekiel's wagon was simple but sturdy, with high wooden sides and a canvas cover stretched over bent hickory hoops. A dappled gray mule stood patiently in the traces, switching its tail at flies. Clara noticed patches on the canvas, places where careful stitching had mended tears, signs of a man who maintained what he had, even if he couldn't afford new. I reckon I should tell you straight off, Ezekiel said as he checked the mule's harness. That gold was most of what I had saved. Been trapping 2 seasons for it. He spoke matter-of-factly, without seeking praise or pity. Seemed right to spend it this way. Clara and Bess exchanged worried glances. They'd been rescued, yes, but at what cost to their savior? And what did he expect in return? Clara had learned young that men rarely gave anything without wanting something back. Mr. Boone, she started, we're grateful, but... No buts needed, he interrupted gently. You needed help. I could give it. Simple as that. He offered his hand to help them into the wagon bed, where blankets had been laid out over fresh straw. As they passed the Golden Nugget Saloon, Raucous laughter spilled out its swinging doors. A cluster of men lounged on the wooden walkway, bottles in hand. "Hey, Boone," one called out. "Bought yourself 2 fat wives today. Hope you got food enough to keep 'em." Clara felt the words like physical blows. Beside her, Bess ducked her head, shoulders hunching, but Ezekiel didn't even turn. He clicked softly to the mule, and the wagon rolled steadily onward, leaving the mockery behind. The sun was sinking toward the western peaks as they left the town behind. The wagon creaked and swayed along the rutted trail, following a creek that wound up into the hills. Aspen trees shivered their golden leaves in the evening breeze, and the air grew cooler as they climbed. "My place is up in the high country," Ezekiel explained, his eyes on the trail ahead. "It's not much. Just a line shack I fixed up some. Roof leaks in one corner when it rains hard and the door sticks in wet weather." He glanced back at them. "Can't offer you fancy things or an easy life, but you'll have safety there and honest work. No man'll trouble you in those hills." Clara watched the unfamiliar landscape roll past, wondering what kind of life awaited them. But when she thought of the auction platform, of their father's drunken cruelty, she knew any future had to be better than what they'd left behind. As darkness settled over the land, Ezekiel guided the wagon off the trail to a small clearing beside the creek. Cottonwoods stood like sentinels around the space, their leaves whispering in the night wind. "We'll camp here," he said, stepping down from the wagon seat. "Creek water's good for drinking, and there's grass for the mule." Clara climbed down, her legs stiff from the ride. She reached for the small bundle of belongings they'd been allowed to keep: some clothes, a few cooking items, and a precious paper packet of dried beans. "I can make supper," she offered, needing to do something useful. "There's enough beans here for 3. Ezekiel nodded, already unhitching the mule. "Much obliged. Been living on jerky and hardtack too long, I reckon." While Clara built a small fire and set the beans to cook in her mother's old pot, Bess knelt in the grass nearby. Her clear voice rose in prayer, thanking God for delivery from evil and asking blessing on their meal. To Clara's surprise, Ezekiel set down the harness he was cleaning and bowed his head. When Bess finished, his deep "Amen" joined with theirs. The beans were simple fare but hot and filling. They ate in companionable silence, with only the creek's gentle music and the distant cry of a coyote breaking the night's peace. Above them, stars pricked through the darkening sky, brilliant and countless in the clear mountain air. Clara watched Ezekiel across the fire. He ate carefully with the measured motions of a man used to making food last. When Bess offered him seconds, he shook his head. "Best save what's left for breakfast," he said. "Still got a fair piece to travel tomorrow." After the meal, he spread blankets for the sisters near the fire, then moved to the wagon's far side with his own bedroll. The gesture of privacy didn't go unnoticed, and Clara felt some of her worry ease. Whatever else this strange situation might bring, it seemed Ezekiel Boone was a man of honor. The fire burned low, its embers casting a faint red glow. Clara lay awake, listening to Bess's steady breathing beside her and the endless song of the creek. The stars above seemed to shine brighter than they ever had in town, as if celebrating their escape. Or perhaps it was their courage in facing an uncertain future that made the heavens glow so fierce and free. In that moment, despite all the fear and humiliation of the day, Clara felt something she hadn't expected: hope. It was small and fragile as a wild bird's egg, but it was there. Whatever tomorrow might bring, they were no longer alone in their struggles. Dawn painted the eastern sky in pale rose and gold as Ezekiel stirred the campfire's remains. The creek burbled its morning song while dew sparkled on the grass. Clara and Bess emerged from their blankets, smoothing their rumpled dresses as best they could. The breakfast was simple. The last of yesterday's beans warmed over the rekindled fire. They ate quickly, aware of the long journey ahead. Ezekiel hitched the mule while the sisters packed away their few belongings and doused the fire with creek water. "Trail gets steeper from here," Ezekiel warned as he helped them into the wagon. "Might want to hold tight to the sides." He wasn't wrong. The path wound upward through stands of aspen and pine, following game trails and old logging tracks. The mule strained against the harness, its muscles bunching as it pulled the loaded wagon over rocky patches. Every bump and dip sent the sisters swaying, their hands gripping the wooden sides. The morning silence stretched thin between them until Clara couldn't bear it any longer. "Mr. Boone," she ventured, her voice barely carrying over the wagon's creaking, "might we know something about you? Where you're from?" Ezekiel was quiet so long she thought he hadn't heard. Then his shoulders shifted beneath his worn jacket. "Virginia, originally," he said. "Left there when the war came. Served as a scout for the Union Army." He paused, hands tightening on the reins. "Had a wife and baby girl back then. Yellow fever took them both while I was away. Ain't had family since." The pain in his voice was old but unhealed, like a wound that never properly closed. Clara wished she hadn't asked, but Bess leaned forward, her natural compassion showing through. "I'm powerful sorry for your loss, Mr. Boone," she said softly. "The good book says the Lord is close to the brokenhearted." Ezekiel nodded once, his expression hidden beneath his hat brim. The wagon continued its slow climb as morning warmed into midday. When they reached a shallow stream crossing, Ezekiel called a halt to rest the mule and fill their water containers. The clear mountain water rushed over smooth stones, catching sunlight like scattered diamonds. Bess volunteered to fill the wooden pail they'd brought. She picked her way carefully over the slick rocks, her skirts gathered in one hand. The current wasn't strong, but the stones were treacherous with green moss. As she bent to dip the pail, her foot slipped. Before she could fall, Ezekiel was there. His strong hand caught her elbow, steadying her with surprising gentleness for such a weathered man. "Easy now," he said. "These rocks can be mighty uncertain." Bess's face flushed pink, but she managed a grateful smile. Together they filled the pail and carried it back to the wagon where Clara waited. The afternoon sun was slanting toward the western peaks when they finally crested a high ridge. Ezekiel drew the mule to a halt. "There it is," he said simply. "Home." The sisters rose carefully to look. Below them lay a small valley, cupped between timbered slopes. A rough log structure huddled against the hillside, Ezekiel's line shack. Its roof sagged slightly in the middle, and the pole corral beside it had several broken rails. A few scraggly goats grazed in the meadow, barely looking up at their arrival. Clara felt her heart sink at the sight. She'd known it wouldn't be much, but the reality of their new home's poverty struck hard. Beside her, Bess's hand found hers and squeezed. They'd survived worse, that grip seemed to say. They would survive this too. Ezekiel cleared his throat. "It ain't much," he admitted, echoing Clara's thoughts. "But it's home. Been meaning to fix that roof, and the corral needs work. Just never seemed worth the effort, living alone." The wagon creaked down the last slope as shadows lengthened across the valley. Up close, the shack looked slightly better. The logs were solid, even if the chinking between them needed repair. A stone chimney rose against one wall, and a small vegetable patch showed signs of recent tending. When Ezekiel pushed open the heavy wooden door, the interior smell hit them first. Smoke from the fireplace, dried herbs hanging from the rafters, and the musky scent of cured hides stacked in one corner. A rough-made table stood in the center, surrounded by 3 mismatched chairs. A narrow bunk hugged one wall, while a ladder led to a small loft space above. Clara's hands itched at the sight of the dusty floor and cobwebbed corners. Without a word, she found a broken-handled broom propped behind the door and began sweeping. The simple action felt good, purposeful, like taking the first step toward making this place livable. Bess moved to help, but first she took a battered tin lantern from their belongings. She cleaned its smoky glass with her apron, filled it with the last of their lamp oil, and set it on the table. Its warm glow softened the cabin's rough edges, making the space feel more welcoming. Ezekiel watched them work from the doorway, something like wonder crossing his weathered features. "Been a while since it looked this tidy," he said. "Never seemed important before." Supper was a humble affair, jerked venison that Ezekiel contributed, and biscuits made from the last of the sisters' flour. They sat at the freshly scrubbed table, the lantern casting friendly shadows on the log walls. 3 bowls, 3 spoons, 3 cups of creek water. It wasn't much, but it was shared willingly. Before eating, they bowed their heads. Bess offered grace, her quiet voice steady in the lantern light. Lord, we thank you for this food, for safe travels, and for bringing us to shelter. Bless this simple meal and the hands that provided it. Amen. Amen, Clara and Ezekiel echoed. After the meal, while Clara wiped the bowls clean with a scrap of cloth, Bess began to hum. It was an old hymn, one their mother had taught them years ago. Clara's voice joined naturally, weaving harmony with her sister's melody. The music filled the drafty room, somehow making it feel warmer, more like a true home. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. Their voices rose and fell together, sweet and true in the gathering dark. Ezekiel leaned against the doorframe, watching the night creep up the valley. But his usual stern expression had softened, and something flickered in his eyes. A warmth, a memory perhaps, of other evenings when music had filled his home. The sisters sang on, their hymn drifting out into the mountain twilight. Inside the humble shack, lantern light gleamed on swept floors and scrubbed tables, on faces tired but peaceful, on the first fragile bonds of a new family taking root in rocky soil. Dawn crept over the mountain valley, painting the frost-touched grass in pale gold. Clara woke to the familiar gnawing of hunger and the unfamiliar creaking of the line shack's timber walls. Through gaps in the logs, she could see the sun wasn't more than a finger's width above the eastern ridge. The cabin's main room lay quiet. Ezekiel had insisted on sleeping in the barn with his mule, leaving the sisters the narrow bunk and loft. Clara eased herself up, careful not to wake Bess, who still slumbered, her face peaceful in the early light. In the corner stood several storage barrels. Clara had noticed them yesterday but hadn't had time to take inventory. Now she lifted the lid of one, hope fluttering in her chest. Inside she found a half-full sack of cornmeal, still good despite its age. The discovery brought a smile to her face. She could make something of this. The wood stove took some coaxing, but soon enough she had a decent fire going. She mixed the cornmeal with water and a pinch of salt from their meager supplies, working by touch and memory the way their mother had taught her. The familiar motions settled her spirit, gave her purpose. As the cornbread began to bake, its sweet aroma filled the cabin. Bess stirred and sat up, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "That smell," she said softly, "reminds me of home." "Found some cornmeal," Clara explained. "Thought we could all use a proper breakfast." Bess nodded and reached for the worn blanket they'd shared, frowning at a large tear along one edge. Without a word, she retrieved her sewing kit, one of the few possessions they'd managed to keep. Her fingers moved steadily, mending the rough wool with tiny, even stitches. The cabin door creaked open and Ezekiel stepped in, ducking his tall frame beneath the low lintel. He paused just inside, as if unsure of his welcome in his own home. His eyes moved from Clara at the stove to Bess with her mending, and something like wonder crossed his weathered face. "Smells mighty fine," he said gruffly. Clara was about to respond when the sound of hoofbeats made them all turn toward the door. Ezekiel's expression hardened as he stepped back outside. Through the open door, Clara saw 3 riders approaching, 2 wearing deputy badges flanking a well-dressed man on a gleaming bay horse. "Ezekiel Boone," the man in the middle called out, his voice carrying a note of smug authority. "I trust we find you well this fine morning?" "State your business, Cutter," Ezekiel growled. The sisters exchanged worried glances at his tone. The man, Cutter, dismounted with elaborate care, brushing dust from his fine coat. "Official business, I'm afraid." He withdrew a leather portfolio from his saddlebag. "I represent the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad Company. I have here documents showing this land has been designated for track expansion." "This is my claim," Ezekiel said. "Been working it 3 years come spring." "Ah, but you see," Cutter smiled, producing a paper with an official-looking seal. "Your claim was never properly registered. The railroad survey takes precedence." He held out the document. "See for yourself, everything's quite legal." Ezekiel snatched the paper, his eyes scanning it quickly. Clara could see his jaw clenching, could read in his rigid shoulders that something was terribly wrong. "This ain't right," he muttered, but his voice held a note of uncertainty. "Oh, it's quite right," Cutter said. His gaze shifted to the cabin door where Clara and Bess now stood. A cruel smile touched his lips. I see you've acquired some companionship. Your fat brides seem comfortable enough, but they'd best not get too settled. You'll all be off this land before snow flies. Ezekiel's fists clenched at the insult. For a moment, Clara feared he might strike the railroad agent, but Cutter was already remounting, clearly enjoying his power over them. 30 days, Boone, he called down. Clear out or we'll clear you out. He touched his hat brim in mock courtesy. Ladies. Then he wheeled his horse, and the three riders thundered away, leaving only dust and the echo of hoofbeats in the crisp morning air. Ezekiel stood rigid, the paper crumpled in his fist. When he finally turned back to the cabin, his face was dark with fury. He began to pace, his boots striking the plank floor with barely contained violence. Ain't right, he muttered again. This is my land. Built this place with my own hands. They can't just... He slammed his fist against the wall, making the whole structure shudder. Clara moved toward him slowly as she might approach a spooked horse. Mr. Boone, she said softly. When he didn't respond, she tried again. Ezekiel. He turned at that, seeming surprised to hear his given name. We have more than we did yesterday, Clara said firmly. We have a place to stand, and we have each other. We'll fight for it. The simple words seemed to reach him. His shoulders lowered slightly, some of the rage leaving his face. Ain't much of a place, he said roughly. It's home. Bess spoke up from where she still sat with her mending. The good Lord didn't bring us here just to have it taken away. A sudden gust of wind rattled the broken shutters, making them all jump. The morning's warmth was fading as clouds gathered over the peaks. Clara moved back to the stove where her cornbread was, by some miracle, not burned. That evening, as the temperature dropped and the wind grew fiercer, they huddled close to the hearth. Ezekiel had split extra wood, and the fire cast warm light on their faces. The broken shutters still rattled, but somehow the sound seemed less threatening when faced together. Clara cut the cornbread into 3 portions, serving it with the last of the venison. They ate in silence, but it was a different kind of quiet than before. Not the awkward silence of strangers, but the shared stillness of people united in purpose. Bess hummed as she finished the last stitches on the blanket. Ezekiel had spread his maps on the table, studying them by lamplight, looking for something that might help their cause. Clara washed their few dishes, her mind already turning over plans for tomorrow, what they could plant, what they could preserve, how to make this place stronger. The railroad man's threat hung over them like the gathering storm clouds, but they faced it together. In just 2 days, they had become something more than 3 lonely souls. They had become a family, and families fought for their homes. The morning after Cutter's threat dawned clear and cool. Work would be their answer to worry, and there was plenty to be done. Ezekiel rose before the sun, the broken corral calling his attention. The weathered posts had rotted at their bases, leaving the enclosure barely fit to hold his 2 goats. He hefted his axe, heading into the stand of pines near the cabin. The steady rhythm of chopping filled the crisp air, and soon he had a pile of fresh posts. His shoulders ached from the work, but it felt good, purposeful. Each post he shaped was another anchor in this land they meant to keep. Meanwhile, Clara ventured out to tend the goats. The creatures eyed her warily at first, unused to a woman's presence, but she spoke to them softly, the way she remembered her mother doing with their old milk cow. Soon enough, they allowed her to approach with a bucket. Easy now, she murmured, settling beside the first nanny. Her hands found a gentle rhythm, and soon warm milk was streaming into the bucket. The simple task brought unexpected joy. They would have something to trade, something to make. Near the cabin door, Bess had discovered a sunny patch of earth. She worked it carefully with a borrowed spade, clearing stones and softening the soil. From her pocket, she drew out a small paper of seeds, herbs she'd saved from their old garden. Thyme, sage, and mint would grow here, she thought. The plants would take root, just as they were trying to do. The Lord provides, she whispered, pressing the tiny seeds into the earth. Inside the cabin, Clara experimented with the morning's milk. She heated it slowly over the stove, adding a bit of vinegar the way she'd once seen done. The milk separated, forming soft white curds. Her first attempt at cheese wasn't pretty, but it was edible. Each day she tried again, and each day it got better. A week passed in this way, all of them working from sunrise to sunset. The corral grew stronger under Ezekiel's hands. The herbs sprouted tender green shoots in Bess's garden. Clara's cheese began to hold its shape. Small victories, but they celebrated each one. Then came the day they needed supplies. The flour was running low, and they had milk and cheese to trade. Loading the wagon for town, Clara and Bess exchanged nervous glances. They hadn't faced the townspeople since the auction. The road seemed shorter than they remembered. Too soon, the buildings of town appeared ahead. Clara gripped the milk jars tighter as faces turned toward their wagon. The whispers started immediately. There they are, the ones from the auction. Mountain Man's women. Can you imagine? Bess began humming a hymn under her breath, drawing strength from the familiar melody. Ezekiel guided the wagon to the mercantile, his face set in stern lines. He helped them down, one sister at a time, his touch gentle but firm, making it clear they were under his protection. Inside the store, Clara arranged their goods on the counter while Bess consulted their list. The shopkeeper's wife eyed their cheese with interest, but before she could speak, two boys who'd been lounging near the penny candy barrel started up. "Look here, the fat sisters. Better reinforce that wagon seat." The words struck like stones, familiar and sharp. Clara felt her face burning. Bess stopped humming, her shoulders hunching inward. The other customers turned to stare, some hiding smirks behind their hands. But then Ezekiel moved. 2 long strides brought him to the counter. He placed his big hand flat on the wooden surface, the sound drawing every eye. His voice, when it came, was quiet but carried to every corner of the suddenly silent store. "They're my family." 3 words, but they changed everything. Clara felt tears pricking at her eyes. Not from shame this time, but from the fierce pride in his tone. Bess reached for her sister's hand, squeezing tight. The boys slunk away. The shopkeeper's wife cleared her throat and began discussing fair trade for the cheese. Other customers returned to their business. But something had shifted. The mockery had met its match in Ezekiel's simple declaration. They completed their trading, exchanging milk and cheese for flour, sugar, and a few other necessities. The wagon rode lighter on the way home, and not just from the traded goods. Bess watched the passing countryside for a while before speaking. "Like as we are adopted into God's family," she said softly, "we find earthly families too. Scripture says it clear. God sets the solitary in families." Ezekiel didn't respond, but his hands tightened slightly on the reins. The rest of the journey passed in comfortable silence, broken only by the creak of wheels and the occasional snort from the mule. That evening, after supper was cleared and the sisters had retired to their bunk, Ezekiel remained by the dying fire. The cabin was quiet save for the soft breathing of the sisters and the pop of settling embers. Slowly, almost hesitantly, he lowered himself to his knees beside his cot. "Lord," he whispered, the word strange on his tongue after so many silent years. "I ain't been much for praying since Sarah and the baby. But these girls—" He paused, struggling for words. "Help me do right by them. Help me be the family they need." In their bunk, Clara and Bess exchanged silent smiles in the darkness. They didn't need to speak. They knew what they'd just witnessed. Like the herbs in Bess's garden, something new was taking root in Ezekiel's heart. Faith, like family, could grow again in the most unexpected places. The night deepened around the cabin, stars wheeling overhead. Inside, 3 people who had been strangers just days ago slept peacefully, each one a little less alone than they had been before. The broken shutters still rattled in the wind, but now they seemed to whisper of hope instead of loneliness. The autumn days grew shorter as October painted the mountain slopes in gold and crimson. One crisp morning, Clara stood at the cabin's single window, watching 2 riders approach on the winding trail. Her heart quickened. They'd never had proper visitors before. "Bess," she called, "the Henderson women are coming." Bess hurried to join her sister, smoothing her apron. They'd met Martha and Ruth Henderson at the general store last week, and something about their kind smiles had given Clara the courage to extend an invitation to supper. Now, watching the women dismount from their horses, she worried if they'd made the right choice. The cabin was still rough, despite their efforts, but the sisters had spent all morning preparing. A pot of venison stew bubbled on the stove, filling the small space with savory aromas. Fresh bread cooled on the table, covered with a clean cloth. They'd even scattered fresh pine needles on the swept dirt floor. Outside, the goats bleated a noisy welcome as Ezekiel helped the Henderson women tie their horses. Clara heard his low rumble of greeting, formal but polite. He'd been uncertain about having company, but hadn't objected when they asked. "Welcome," Bess called as the door creaked open. "We're so glad you could come." Martha Henderson, a tall woman with silver-streaked hair, ducked through the doorway first. Her younger sister, Ruth, followed, carrying a cloth-wrapped bundle that turned out to be a jar of preserved peaches. "Land sakes, but something smells wonderful in here," Martha said, breathing deeply. The first few minutes were awkward, everyone speaking too carefully and moving too stiffly. Clara's hands shook slightly as she ladled stew into their best bowls, wedding gifts from their mother, carried all the way from Kansas. But then Ruth noticed the dried herbs hanging from the rafters. "Is that sage I smell in the bread?" "Yes," Bess brightened. "From our little garden. Would you like to see it?" The two younger women stepped outside, their voices growing animated as Bess showed off her thriving herbs. Martha helped Clara set the table, asking quiet questions about their journey west. Ezekiel sat in his corner, whittling a piece of pine but clearly listening. When everyone gathered around the table, Clara held her breath. But Martha took a spoonful of stew and closed her eyes in appreciation. "Oh my, this is fine cooking." "Indeed it is," Ruth agreed. "You must share your secret for such tender meat." Clara felt warmth spread through her chest. "Well, the trick is to cook it slow, with just a touch of vinegar." The conversation flowed easier after that. Martha told stories about their first winter in the territory, making them laugh with tales of learning to shoot a rifle while wearing skirts. Ruth spoke of her husband's trading post further up the mountain, and how they'd survived the last harsh winter. "You'll need to bank snow against the north wall," she advised. "Keeps the wind from stealing all your heat." As they finished the stew and moved on to peaches, Bess began humming softly. Ruth joined in, recognizing the hymn, and soon all three women were singing "Amazing Grace" in sweet harmony. Their voices filled the cabin, making it feel larger somehow, more blessed. Then something extraordinary happened. Ezekiel's deep bass joined in on the last verse, startling them all. His voice was rough from disuse but true, and when he laughed at their surprised faces, the sound shook the rafters. Clara couldn't remember ever hearing him laugh before. "Why, Mr. Boone," Martha said, eyes twinkling, "you've been holding out on us." "Ain't sung since the war," he admitted. "Forgot how good it feels." They sang more hymns after that and shared more stories. The Henderson sisters told them about other families scattered through the hills, people who might welcome new neighbors. As darkness fell outside, the cabin glowed with warmth and fellowship. When it was time for their guests to leave, Martha hugged both sisters. "You've made something special here," she said. "A true home." After the Henderson women rode away, the three of them stood in the doorway, watching their lanterns disappear down the trail. The night was clear, stars pricking through the darkening sky like silver pins. Ezekiel cleared his throat. "I need to say something." Clara and Bess turned to him, worried at his serious tone. "When I brought you here, I thought I was doing you a kindness." He looked down at his rough hands. "But truth is, you gave me more than I gave you. You brought light back into my life, made this place a home again." Bess's eyes filled with tears. Clara reached for her sister's hand, her own heart too full for words. They stood together in the doorway for a long moment, listening to the night sounds and feeling the rhythm of their shared breathing. That night, Clara fell asleep with hope swelling in her heart. For the first time since their father had dragged them onto that auction platform, she felt truly safe, truly home. But the next morning dawned gray and heavy with clouds. Clara woke feeling strange, her chest tight. As she stirred the breakfast porridge, a cough rattled through her, sharp and deep. "Sister?" Bess looked up from setting the table. "Are you well?" "Just a chill," Clara tried to smile, but another cough shook her frame. She gripped the stove edge, suddenly dizzy. "You're shivering." Bess pressed a hand to Clara's forehead. "Lord have mercy, you're burning up. Ezekiel." He appeared from outside, taking in the scene with one quick glance. Without a word, he lifted Clara as easily as a child and carried her to the sisters' bunk. Bess tucked their thickest quilt around her, but Clara's teeth still chattered. "I'll brew willow bark tea," Bess said, trying to keep her voice steady. But as she moved about the cabin, gathering herbs with trembling hands, fear crept back into their newfound peace. By evening, Clara's fever had worsened. She tossed restlessly, her face flushed, her breathing labored. Bess sat beside her, wringing out cool cloths for her forehead and praying under her breath. Ezekiel paced the cabin's length, his footsteps heavy with worry. Just yesterday, they'd been singing hymns and sharing peaches, certain that happiness had finally taken root in their lives. Now, darkness pressed against the windows, and Clara's ragged breathing filled the cabin with a different kind of music, one that spoke of fear and loss and the fragility of all their dreams. 3 days passed like a slow fever dream. Clara's condition worsened despite Bess's constant care. The willow bark tea grew cold in cups beside the bed as Clara struggled to keep anything down. Her skin burned hot as the cook stove, yet she shivered beneath every blanket they owned. "Please drink, sister," Bess whispered, holding the tin cup to Clara's cracked lips. "Just a little more." Clara's eyes fluttered open, glassy with fever. "Mama," she mumbled, then turned her face away. Ezekiel watched from the doorway, his weathered face etched with worry. He'd never felt so useless. The morning sun was barely touching the mountain peaks when he decided he couldn't wait any longer. "I'm riding to town for the doctor," he announced, already pulling on his coat. Bess looked up from where she sat beside Clara's bed, dark circles under her eyes from sleepless nights of vigil. "God be with you," she said softly. The trail into town seemed twice as long as usual. Ezekiel's mule picked its way carefully down the steep path while his mind raced ahead. The doctor had helped them before, treating minor ailments with herbs and sensible advice. Surely he would know what to do for Clara. But when Ezekiel reached the doctor's house, he found only the man's wife, hanging washing in the yard. "I'm sorry, Mr. Boone," she said, genuine regret in her voice. "Dr. Warren got called east 3 days ago. A typhoid outbreak in the mining camp." She twisted her apron in her hands. "He won't be back for at least a week." Ezekiel's heart sank. "Ain't there anyone else who might help?" "You might try Preacher Matthews," she suggested. "He knows something of healing." The preacher was in his study, a small room that smelled of leather-bound books and pipe tobacco. He listened gravely to Ezekiel's description of Clara's symptoms, stroking his gray beard. "What she needs is prayer, brother," he said finally. "The Lord's healing touch is more powerful than any earthly medicine." "With respect, preacher," Ezekiel's voice was tight with frustration, "we've been praying. What we need is something to break her fever." But the preacher only shook his head and offered to visit later in the week. Ezekiel left empty-handed, despair settling heavy in his chest. The sun was setting by the time he made it back to the cabin. Golden light slanted through the windows, catching dust motes in its beams. Inside, Bess's clear voice rose and fell in a familiar hymn. "Be not dismayed whate'er betide, God will take care of you." She sat in the same spot he'd left her, one hand holding Clara's while the other dampened a cloth in a basin of water. Clara's breathing was shallow and quick, her face flushed with fever. "No doctor?" Bess asked, though she could read the answer in his face. Ezekiel shook his head. "Gone east, won't be back for days." He sank onto a chair, bone-weary. "Preacher just offered prayers." "Then we'll keep praying," Bess said firmly, though her voice quavered. "And we'll keep fighting." The wind picked up as night fell, howling around the cabin's corners like a hungry wolf. Ezekiel paced the floorboards, each creak matching the rhythm of Clara's labored breathing. The lantern cast jumping shadows on the walls, making the small room seem to shift and dance. They all heard the horses approaching, multiple sets of hooves, moving with purpose. Ezekiel's hand went to his rifle, but before he could reach it, the door burst open. Silas Cutter stood in the doorway, flanked by 2 deputies. Their badges gleamed dully in the lantern light. "Evening, Boone." Cutter's smile was cold as a snake's. "Heard you've got trouble up here. Seemed like a good time to settle our business." "Get out," Ezekiel growled. "This ain't the time." "Oh, I think it's the perfect time." Cutter stepped inside, looking around with exaggerated interest. "When else will you be so distracted?" The deputies moved in behind him. Outside, more men were walking toward the goat corral, carrying axes. "You can't do this." Bess stood up, her voice stronger than Ezekiel had ever heard it. "We have rights." "Rights?" Cutter laughed. "A squatter and his 2 fat—" Ezekiel's fist caught him before he could finish the insult. Cutter stumbled backward, blood spurting from his nose. The deputies rushed forward. The fight was brief and brutal. Ezekiel was strong, but there were too many of them. They beat him down, boots thudding against ribs, while Bess screamed and Clara tossed in her fever dreams. Through the open door came the sound of splintering wood as the men outside took their axes to the corral. "That's enough," Cutter said, wiping blood from his face. "Take him to jail. Let him cool his heels while we clear this land properly." They dragged Ezekiel out into the night. The last thing he saw was Bess's face in the doorway, tears streaming down her cheeks as she watched them haul him away. In the cabin, Bess stood frozen until the sound of hoofbeats faded. Then she closed and barred the door with trembling hands. The wind still howled outside, and now there was a new sound, the frightened bleating of goats as the men continued destroying the corral. She sank to her knees beside Clara's bed. Her sister's breathing was worse, each breath a terrible struggle. The lantern flickered, throwing strange shadows across Clara's face. "Please, Lord," Bess whispered, clasping her hands tight. "Give me strength. Show me what to do." She began to pray in earnest, her words tumbling out between sobs. "We need your help now. Clara needs healing. Ezekiel needs freedom, and we need protection. Please, Father, don't abandon us now." The wind rattled the shutters like mocking laughter. Outside, an axe bit deep into wood, and a post fell with a crash. But Bess kept praying, her faith the only light left in the gathering darkness. Clara stirred restlessly, murmuring in her delirium. Bess reached for the cloth, wringing it out once more in the cooling water. As she bathed her sister's forehead, she began to sing again, her voice thin but determined. "All you may need he will provide, and God will take care of you." The lantern flame danced, casting its weak light over Bess's tears as she continued her vigil, alone except for her faith in her dying sister. The jail cell smelled of old straw and despair. Ezekiel sat on the hard wooden bench, his ribs aching from the beating. Moonlight filtered through the barred window, casting shadows that danced like ghosts across the floor. Each shadow brought memories he'd tried so hard to forget. He closed his eyes, but that only made the memories sharper. The acrid smoke of battlefield fires, the screams of dying men. His wife Sarah's face, pale with fever in their small Tennessee cabin. Their little boy James, barely 4 years old, buried beside her when the sickness took them both. So many graves, his family, his comrades, all those lives reduced to wooden crosses and shallow holes in the earth. "Not again," he whispered into the darkness. "Lord, please, not again." His bruised hands clenched into fists. Clara's fevered face floated before him, so like Sarah's in those final days. And Bess, brave, faithful Bess, left alone to face whatever cruelty Cutter might devise. They weren't just 2 women he'd rescued anymore. They were family, his family. "I won't lose them," he vowed, his voice rough with emotion. "Whatever it takes, I won't lose another family." The night wore on, each hour marked by the deputy's boots clicking past on his rounds. Ezekiel's prayers mingled with memories until he could hardly tell them apart. Back at the shack, Bess fought her own battle against fear and exhaustion. The cabin felt wrong without Ezekiel's steady presence. Every creak of the settling logs made her jump. Outside, the wind whistled through the broken corral, and the nervous goats bleated in the darkness. "The Lord is my shepherd," Bess recited, wringing out another cool cloth for Clara's forehead. Her voice trembled, but she forced herself to continue. "I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures." Clara stirred restlessly on the bed, her skin still burning with fever. The lantern was running low on oil, making the shadows deeper in the corners. A shutter banged against the wall. They hadn't had time to fix it properly before all this started. "He leadeth me beside the still waters," Bess went on, though tears threatened to choke her words. "He restoreth my soul." The night seemed endless. Bess sang every hymn she knew, prayed every prayer she could remember. She dozed briefly near dawn, only to jerk awake at a sudden noise. But it was just the wind, always the wind, moaning around the cabin like a lost soul. The second day passed in a blur of worry and work. Bess managed to milk the remaining goats, though her hands shook with fatigue. She heated broth for Clara, praying her sister could keep it down. Every hour without word from town stretched her nerves tighter. On the third night, hoofbeats approached the cabin. Bess's heart leaped into her throat. She grabbed Ezekiel's old rifle, though she barely knew how to use it. But when she peered through the window, she saw a familiar figure in a black coat. "Preacher Matthews?" she whispered, opening the door cautiously. The preacher slipped inside, glancing nervously over his shoulder. His usually neat gray beard was unkempt, his eyes tired but determined. "Miss Bess," he said quietly, "I've come to help, though I should have done so sooner." He pulled a leather satchel from beneath his coat. Inside were yellowed papers, their edges crumbling with age. "Land records," he explained, spreading them carefully on the table. "I found them in the church archives. They prove Ezekiel's claim is legitimate. His grandfather purchased this land outright in 1838. The railroad has no right to seize it." Bess stared at the documents, hope rising in her chest for the first time in days. "But why didn't you bring these forward before?" The preacher's shoulders slumped. "Fear," he admitted. "Shame. The railroad has brought money to our town, and I convinced myself it wasn't my place to interfere." He looked up, his eyes wet. "But I was wrong. When I saw them drag Ezekiel away, I knew I couldn't stay silent anymore. Can these save him, save our home? If we can get them to the circuit judge in time. He's due in Carson City tomorrow." The preacher gripped her hand. "Hold on until then. I'll present these myself, first thing in the morning." Bess clutched the papers like a lifeline. "Thank you," she whispered. "God bless you for this." After the preacher left, Bess sat by Clara's bed, her mind racing. The papers were hope, yes, but tomorrow might be too late. Ezekiel was still in jail, at Cutter's mercy. And Clara. She looked at her sister's pale face. The fever had dropped slightly, but Clara was terribly weak. Could she last another day without proper medicine? As if hearing her thoughts, Clara's eyes fluttered open. "Bess?" she mumbled. "I'm here." Bess took her hand. "Rest easy." "Ezekiel? Still in town, but we have proof now. Proof this land is rightfully ours." Bess explained about the preacher's visit and the records. Clara's grip tightened weakly on her sister's hand. "Then what are you waiting for?" "I can't leave you." "Yes, you can." Clara's voice was faint but determined. "You have to. Take the wagon. Take the proof to town. Save our family." Bess hesitated, torn between her sister's needs and the urgent pull of action. But Clara was right. They had to fight back now, while they had the chance. As the first gray light of dawn touched the windows, Bess packed a bundle of food, the last of the bread, some dried apples, a jar of goat's milk. She tucked the precious land records into her shawl, close to her heart. At the door, she turned back one last time. Clara managed a weak smile. "Don't give up," she whispered. "We didn't come this far to lose now." Bess's throat tightened with tears, but she nodded firmly. "I'll be back soon," she promised. "With Ezekiel. With help. She climbed into the wagon, checking that everything was secure. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine from the high country. As she picked up the reins, Bess whispered one more prayer. Lord, give me strength, give me courage, help me save our family. The wagon creaked as it started down the trail, every turn of the wheels carrying her closer to town, and whatever fate awaited them there. The mule wagon creaked through the pre-dawn darkness, each jolt sending shivers through Bess's tired body. She clutched the reins with trembling hands, the precious quilt bundled beside her. Inside its carefully stitched seams lay their mother's final gift, silver coins saved in secret, hidden from their father's drinking money. The eastern sky began to lighten, painting the mountain peaks in shades of rose and gold. Bess whispered another prayer, drawing strength from the familiar words. The wagon wheels left twin tracks in the morning dew as she guided them down the winding trail toward town. Main Street was quiet when she arrived, only a few early risers sweeping their storefronts or leading horses to water. Bess tied the mule outside the jailhouse, her heart pounding. Through the barred window, she caught a glimpse of Ezekiel's broad shoulders, slumped in defeat. Miss Haskins? She turned to find Preacher Matthews hurrying toward her, his black coat flapping. His face was drawn with worry, but his eyes were determined. He pressed a leather folder into her hands. The land records, he whispered. I was just heading to the courthouse. Judge Parker arrived early. He's hearing cases now. Bess clutched both the folder and her mother's quilt. Then we mustn't waste a moment. Together they crossed the dusty street to the courthouse, a weathered wooden building with peeling white paint. Inside, oil lamps cast flickering shadows on the bare walls. Judge Parker, a lean man with iron-gray hair, looked up from his desk as they entered. Your Honor, the preacher began, we have urgent business regarding Ezekiel Boone's imprisonment. The squatter, the judge frowned. Railroad agent Cutter presented clear evidence. False evidence, Bess interrupted, her voice stronger than she felt. She stepped forward, laying the land records on his desk. These documents prove Ezekiel's grandfather purchased that land outright in 1838. The railroad has no right to seize it. The judge was studying the yellowed papers when the courthouse door banged open. Silas Cutter strode in, his fancy boots clicking on the wooden floor. His face darkened when he saw Bess and the preacher. Your Honor, these people are interfering with legitimate railroad business, he sneered. That land was clearly marked for track expansion. These records say otherwise, Judge Parker murmured, turning another brittle page. This deed appears genuine. Cutter's lip curled. A convenient forgery. And even if it were real, who's to say this mountain man can pay his proper taxes? The territory needs progress, not backwards hill folk cluttering up valuable land. Bess's hands trembled as she unwrapped her mother's quilt. The familiar patterns, tree of life, North Star, flying geese, seemed to give her courage. Carefully, she broke the hidden stitching in the border seam. Silver coins spilled onto the judge's desk with a musical chiming. Here are the back taxes, she said quietly. Every penny owed plus interest. Our mother saved this money for years, hiding it from our father's drinking. She wanted us to have a chance at a real home someday. The judge picked up one of the coins, examining it in the lamplight. His expression softened as he looked at Bess's worn dress, her determined face. Mr. Cutter, he said slowly, these land records are legitimate. The deed is clear, and the taxes are now paid in full. Furthermore, he fixed Cutter with a stern gaze. I've heard disturbing reports about your methods of acquiring land. Threats, forgery, violence, these have no place in a civilized territory. This is absurd. Cutter's face had gone red. You're choosing these worthless... Choose your next words carefully, the judge cut in. I'm ruling in favor of Ezekiel Boone. His claim stands. And Mr. Cutter, I suggest you find legal means to expand your railroad, or you may find yourself facing charges. Cutter's hands clenched into fists. He glared at Bess with naked hatred. This isn't over, he spat. You'll regret crossing me. He stormed out, slamming the door behind him. Deputy, the judge called, release Mr. Boone immediately, and see that Mr. Cutter leaves town today. Bess's knees went weak with relief. The preacher steadied her with a gentle hand on her arm. "Well done, child," he whispered. "Well done indeed." Minutes later, Ezekiel emerged from the jailhouse, squinting in the morning light. His face was bruised, his clothes dirty, but his eyes lit up when he saw Bess waiting. She ran to him without thinking, and his strong arms wrapped around her. "You saved me," he said hoarsely, "saved our home." "We saved each other," Bess replied, stepping back to look up at him. "That's what family does." Ezekiel took her hands in his calloused ones, his expression solemn. "I promise you this. Never again will you face trouble alone. You and Clara are my family now, truly and forever. Whatever comes, we'll meet it together." Tears spilled down Bess's cheeks as she nodded. "We should hurry home," she said. "Clara's been so worried." They rode back in the wagon together, Ezekiel handling the reins while Bess told him everything: the preacher's help, her mother's hidden coins, the judge's ruling. The sun was setting by the time they crested the final ridge, painting the sky in deep gold and purple. Smoke rose from the cabin's chimney, a welcome sight. Inside, they found Clara propped up in bed, her fever finally broken. Though still weak, her face glowed with joy at seeing Ezekiel safe. "You did it," she whispered as Bess tucked the quilt around her. "You saved us all." "No," Ezekiel said, his deep voice gentle. "We saved each other." He settled into the chair beside Clara's bed, while Bess stirred the fire. "Now rest easy. You're both home safe, where you belong." Tears glistened in Clara's eyes as she reached for both their hands. Outside, the wind sang through the pines, no longer a lonely sound, but a song of hope and family found at last. The mountain cabin's interior glowed with soft lamplight as Ezekiel sat beside Clara's bed, carefully spooning warm chicken broth between her pale lips. His weathered hands, once used to gripping rifle stocks and skinning knives, now moved with surprising tenderness. Bess watched from near the hearth, amazed at how gentle the gruff mountain man had become. "Just a little more," Ezekiel murmured, his deep voice softer than usual. "You need your strength." Clara managed a few more sips before turning her head weakly on the pillow. Though her fever had broken, recovery came slowly. The illness had left her thin and tired, dark circles shadowing her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "I never thought to see such kindness from—" She paused, uncertain how to continue. "From a rough old mountain man?" Ezekiel's mouth quirked in a half-smile. He set the empty bowl aside and pulled his chair closer to her bedside. The lamplight caught the silver threading through his dark hair, highlighting the new worry lines etched around his eyes. Days passed in this gentle rhythm. Bess tended the goats and kept house while Ezekiel nursed Clara with patient dedication. He brought her water, propped her up with pillows, and even combed her long hair when it tangled. Each small act of care seemed to smooth away another layer of his hardened exterior. One evening, as the setting sun painted the cabin walls in amber light, Ezekiel sat beside Clara's bed, watching her drift between sleep and waking. Her color had finally begun to return, a hint of pink touching her cheeks. He reached out and took her hand in his calloused one. "Clara," he said softly, waiting until her eyes focused on his face. "I need you to hear something." She nodded, her fingers curling weakly around his. "When I first saw you and Bess at that auction, I acted on instinct. Couldn't bear to see you treated like animals." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "But these past weeks, caring for you both, watching you make this broken-down shack into a real home, I want you to know something. You're no burden to me. You're a blessing. Both of you." Tears welled in Clara's eyes, spilling down her cheeks. "Oh, Lord," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Thank you. Thank you for bringing us to this place, to this man." Bess, who had been quietly mending by the fire, set aside her work and crossed to the bed. She took Clara's other hand, completing their circle. "We should give proper thanks," she said firmly. "When Clara's stronger, we ought to gather the neighbors for prayer, show our gratitude for God's mercy." Ezekiel nodded slowly. "Reckon you're right. And maybe it's time we went to church proper." The sisters exchanged surprised glances. They hadn't dared suggest it, knowing how Ezekiel avoided town gatherings. The following Sunday dawned clear and cool. Clara, though still weak, insisted she felt strong enough to travel. They hitched the mule to the wagon, padding the seat with quilts to make her comfortable. Bess helped her sister dress in their best clothes, faded but clean, while Ezekiel put on his one good shirt, the collar stiff with starch. The wagon wheels left twin tracks in the morning dew as they made their way down the mountain trail. Clara leaned against Bess, drawing strength from her sister's warmth. Ezekiel handled the reins with steady hands, though his jaw tightened as they approached town. Main Street was busy with churchgoers when they arrived, ladies in their Sunday best and men in polished boots. Heads turned as Ezekiel helped Clara and Bess down from the wagon. Whispers followed them up the church steps, but Ezekiel walked tall, a sister on each arm. Inside, the little church was already filling with familiar faces: the mercantile owner, the blacksmith and his wife, ranchers from nearby spreads. Some nodded greeting, others quickly looked away. The sisters settled into a back pew, Ezekiel beside them, his broad shoulders straight beneath his worn coat. Sunlight streamed through the simple windows as Preacher Matthews led them in familiar hymns. Clara's voice was still weak, but she hummed along while Bess sang clear and strong. Ezekiel remained silent, though his fingers tapped gently against his knee in time with the music. After the sermon, the preacher called for testimonies. A heavy silence fell over the congregation. Then, to the sisters' amazement, Ezekiel rose to his feet. His chair scraped against the wooden floor as he stood, drawing every eye in the church. "I got something to say," he announced, his deep voice carrying to the rafters. Preacher Matthews nodded encouragement. "Speak your heart, Brother Boone." Ezekiel cleared his throat. "Most of you know me as a loner, a man who keeps to himself up in the hills. After the war took my first family, I reckoned that was all I'd ever be." He paused, looking down at Clara and Bess. "But the Lord had other plans. He sent these women into my life. 2 sisters I found being sold like cattle. I thought I was saving them, but truth is, they saved me." A murmur rippled through the church. Clara pressed her handkerchief to her lips, tears sliding down her cheeks. Bess reached across to squeeze her sister's hand. "They turned my shack into a home," Ezekiel continued. "Brought music and prayer back into my life. Showed me what family means again." His voice grew husky with emotion. "The Lord restored what was broken in me through their goodness. I stand here today to give him thanks and to declare before you all that these women are my family now. Whatever comes, we face it together." The church fell silent as he finished. Then Preacher Matthews stepped forward, laying a hand on Ezekiel's shoulder. "Amen, brother. The Lord works in mysterious ways, turning sorrow to joy, making families from strangers." Several women in the congregation dabbed at their eyes. The blacksmith's wife was openly weeping. Even some of the men who had once mocked the sisters now looked thoughtful, perhaps seeing them through new eyes. As the service ended, people came forward to greet them. The mercantile owner's wife invited them to Sunday dinner. A rancher offered Clara a jar of his wife's tonic for strength. The atmosphere had shifted, respect replacing ridicule. They drove home in peaceful silence, the wagon swaying gently beneath them. The late morning sun warmed their backs as they climbed the familiar trail, heading toward the place that had become their true home. Clara reached out to touch Ezekiel's arm. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." He covered her hand with his own, his eyes still fixed on the trail ahead. "No need for thanks between family." Bess hummed a hymn of gratitude as they rode, her clear voice carrying across the valley. The sound seemed to echo off the mountainsides, a song of hope and healing, of broken lives made whole again through love and faith. After the final hymn faded in the little church, townsfolk gathered around the Boone family. Clara sat quietly in the pew, still weak from her illness but smiling as women approached with covered dishes and kind words. "Made this chicken soup special," Mrs. Peterson said, pressing a ceramic pot into Bess's hands. "Good for building strength." The blacksmith's wife offered a loaf of fresh bread, while others brought preserves and dried herbs. Each gift came with gentle touches and warm smiles, a stark contrast to the cruel jeers of weeks past. Not everyone had changed heart, though. Near the door, 3 men whispered and smirked, their eyes following the sisters with familiar mockery. Ezekiel noticed but held his peace, focusing instead on those showing kindness. At the general store, Ezekiel traded wheels of Clara's goat cheese for nails and lumber. The shopkeeper, impressed by the cheese's quality, offered a fair price. "Fine product," he said, weighing out nails. "My wife says it's better than any she's had before." Loading supplies into the wagon, Ezekiel outlined his plans. "Roof needs replacing before winter, shutters too, and that corral won't hold through another storm." The sisters sat close together on the wagon seat as they headed home, a basket of food between them. Clara's face was tired but content, her hand steady on Bess's arm. The next morning brought clear skies and cool air, perfect weather for repairs. Ezekiel rose before dawn, studying the cabin's worn exterior. Years of neglect had left their mark, but now he had reason to make it right. Clara insisted on helping despite her weakness, sorting nails while seated in a chair by the door. Bess proved surprisingly capable with a hammer, following Ezekiel's instructions to secure loose boards. "Ain't proper women's work," he'd protested at first. "Neither is being sold at auction," Bess had replied firmly. "We'll work as family here." That settled the matter. Day by day they transformed the cabin. New shingles replaced rotted ones, fresh-cut boards strengthened walls, and repaired shutters swung smoothly on oiled hinges. The broken corral rose again, stronger than before. Clara's strength returned gradually. Though she still tired easily, each day saw her doing more. She directed work from her chair, keeping track of supplies, and ensuring meals appeared regularly. "You're pushing too hard," Bess would scold when Clara tried to do more than she should. "Can't help it," Clara would reply. "First time I've felt truly useful." Ezekiel would shake his head at their bickering, but his eyes held warmth. The cabin echoed with the sounds of work and conversation, so different from the lonely silence of before. By week's end, the transformation was remarkable. Fresh-cut pine glowed golden in the sunlight, new windows gleamed, and the repaired door swung true on its hinges. Even the yard looked better, with split firewood neatly stacked and the corral properly fenced. "Time for a proper celebration," Clara announced one evening. "Let's invite neighbors for a hymn sing." Ezekiel hesitated but couldn't deny the joy in her eyes. "Reckon we could," he agreed. "Cabin's fit for company now." Word spread quickly. Saturday evening found wagons and riders arriving at dusk, lantern lights spilling through the new windows to guide them. Women brought pies and cakes, men carried extra chairs, and children darted about with excitement. Inside, the cabin glowed with welcome. Clara had scrubbed every surface until it shone, while Bess arranged benches and chairs in a circle. The fresh swept floor and new curtains transformed the once dreary room. As darkness fell, voices rose in song. Clara and Bess led the singing, their voices blending in familiar harmony. When Amazing Grace began, Ezekiel's deep baritone joined in, surprising everyone, himself included. The sound filled the cabin, spilling out into the night. "Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound of that saved a wretch like me." The words seemed to touch something deep in Ezekiel. His voice grew stronger with each verse, years of silence falling away. Clara watched him with shining eyes, while Bess smiled through her tears. Outside in the darkness, beyond the circle of lamplight, Silas Cutter stood in the shadows. His face twisted as he watched the scene through the window. The sight of Ezekiel surrounded by neighbors, the sisters accepted and respected, made his jaw clench with rage. Legal defeat still burned bitter in his throat. His carefully forged documents had failed, his plans thwarted by a preacher's conscience and a girl's determination. But he wasn't finished. Not by far. Inside, unaware of the watching eyes, the hymn sing continued. Neighbors who had once turned away now shared bench space with the sisters, passing plates of pie and mugs of coffee. Children sat cross-legged on the floor, voices lifting in praise. The cabin had become more than shelter. It was a true home, filled with light and song. When the last wagon departed, Ezekiel stood in the doorway watching the lanterns disappear down the trail. Clara and Bess cleaned up inside, humming softly as they worked. Never thought to hear such singing in this old place, he said quietly. Home sounds different when it's filled with family, Clara replied, resting her hand on his arm. He covered her hand with his own, nodding slowly. The night air carried a hint of autumn chill, but inside the cabin, warmth remained. The warmth of belonging, of bonds stronger than blood. Far down the trail, hidden by darkness, Cutter mounted his horse. His bitter thoughts churned with schemes of revenge, but for now, they remained only thoughts. The light from the cabin windows caught his eye one last time before he turned away, hatred burning cold in his heart. The first snow arrived silently in the night, transforming the ridge into a white wonderland by morning. Bess discovered it when she rose early to check the goats, her excited gasp waking Clara and Ezekiel. Look, she called from the doorway. Everything's white as sugar. The landscape had changed completely. Where brown grass and rocky ground had been, now lay smooth drifts of pristine snow. Icicles hung like crystal daggers from the eaves, catching the pale dawn light. Clara wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and joined her sister. Beautiful, she breathed, but it means hard times ahead. Ezekiel nodded grimly. Best get the goats inside before they freeze. That old lean-to won't hold against mountain winter. They spent that morning clearing space in the cabin's corner, laying fresh straw for the animals. The goats protested being moved, but soon settled near the warmth of the hearth. Their soft bleating became a constant backdrop to cabin life. Smells like a barn in here, Ezekiel grumbled, but his eyes held amusement. Better than frozen goats, Clara replied practically. Besides, their warmth will help heat the cabin. As days grew shorter and storms more frequent, they fell into new rhythms. Clara set up her quilting frame near the window, piecing together scraps of fabric into warm coverings. Her clever fingers created patterns from even the smallest bits, stars, pinwheels, and flying geese taking shape under her needle. Bess divided her time between tending the goats and helping wherever needed. She learned to milk them indoors, collecting precious drops for cheese and butter. The animals grew accustomed to her gentle hands and soft hymn singing. Ezekiel spent long hours in the cold, checking his trap lines for rabbit and fox. He returned with frozen beard and frost-covered coat, but usually carrying some small game for the pot. When snow was too deep for trapping, he split wood until the pile grew tall against the cabin wall. Despite the hardships, laughter found its way into their days. One morning, a particularly ornery goat head-butted Ezekiel as he bent to fill the water bucket, sending him sprawling. Instead of anger, his deep chuckle joined the sisters' giggles. Reckon she's letting me know who's boss, he said, brushing off snow. As December deepened, Bess began talking about Christmas. We should celebrate proper, she insisted, even if we haven't much. Clara opened their mother's old trunk, pulling out carefully hoarded ribbons. We could decorate a pine branch, she suggested. Make it festive. Ezekiel said nothing, but the next day he returned with a perfect small pine branch, its needles still green and fragrant. He fixed it to the wall while the sisters clapped in delight. Ain't much of a tree, he mumbled. It's perfect, Bess declared, already reaching for the ribbons. They worked together, transforming the humble branch into something magical. Clara's red ribbons made bright bows, while Bess strung dried berries she'd saved from fall. Even Ezekiel contributed, whittling small wooden stars to hang from the tips. The days before Christmas brought secret activity. Clara disappeared behind her quilting frame for hours, while Bess whispered and giggled over mysterious bundles. Ezekiel spent extra time in his workshop, the sound of his knife against wood carrying through the walls. Christmas Eve arrived clear and cold. Stars pierced the dark sky like diamonds, while snow crystals sparkled in the lamplight. Inside the cabin, warmth and excitement filled the air. Clara had outdone herself with supper. Though simple, the meal felt like a feast. Cornbread baked golden brown, tender jerky stewed with dried vegetables, and Bess's precious saved sugar transformed into small cookies. Tastes like heaven, Ezekiel declared, savoring a cookie. After the dishes were cleared, they gathered around the hearth. The decorated pine branch glowed in the firelight, ribbons casting dancing shadows on the wall. Even the goats seemed to sense the special occasion, settling quietly in their corner. Time for gifts. Bess announced, practically bouncing with excitement. They had agreed to exchange only handmade presents, each creating something from their heart and hands. Clara went first, presenting carefully wrapped packages. "To keep you warm," she said softly. Inside, they found mittens she had knitted from carefully unraveled wool, lined with soft rabbit fur from Ezekiel's traps. For Bess, bright red mittens decorated with tiny snowflakes. For Ezekiel, sturdy black ones reinforced for work. Bess gave Clara a new apron, cleverly pieced from flour sacks and decorated with careful embroidery. For Ezekiel, she had copied his favorite psalms into a small book, her neat handwriting filling pages bound with twine. Ezekiel shifted uncomfortably when his turn came. "Ain't much," he muttered, holding out his gifts. But the sisters gasped in delight. For Clara, a perfectly shaped wooden spoon, smooth as silk and decorated with carved leaves. For Bess, a new hymn book he'd traded for in town, its pages fresh and clean. "One more thing," he said gruffly, reaching for his Bible. Thought we could read the Christmas story. Together like." The sisters settled close as his deep voice filled the cabin, reading the familiar words of Christ's birth. Though his voice was rough, it held reverence as he spoke of shepherds and angels, of a baby born in a manger. "Glory to God in the highest," he read, "and on earth peace, goodwill toward men." When he finished, Bess began singing softly, "Silent Night." Clara joined in, their voices twining together as naturally as always. After a moment, Ezekiel's baritone added its warmth to the harmony. Outside, snow began falling again, large flakes drifting past the windows like feathers. But inside the cabin, all was peace and warmth. The fire crackled softly, casting golden light over their faces. Even the goats seemed to listen as carol after carol filled the air. Clara looked around the cabin, at the decorated branch, the rough-hewn furniture, the beloved faces of her family. Poverty might hem them in, but love and faith had turned this simple shelter into a true home. "Merry Christmas," she whispered, her heart full. Ezekiel reached out, taking both sisters' hands in his. "Merry Christmas," he echoed softly, "and God bless us, everyone." The snow continued falling, wrapping their mountain home in silence. But inside, joy glowed as bright as the fire, warming them all with its gentle light. They had found what mattered most, not in presents or feasts, but in the miracle of family, faith, and love. January brought bitter cold to the mountain homestead. Snow lay deep across the ridge, broken only by Ezekiel's daily tracks to check his trap lines. Inside the cabin, Clara and Bess kept busy with endless winter tasks, feeding goats, mending clothes, preserving what food they had left. Their life had fallen into peaceful rhythms, but peace rarely lasts when hatred festers. The trouble began one frigid morning. Ezekiel went to check the goat pen and found the fence posts knocked down, tracks in the snow showing where the animals had scattered. His jaw tightened as he studied the boot prints left behind. Too many for one man. "Clara, Bess," he called, "the goats are gone." The sisters rushed out, shawls pulled tight against the cold. Clara's face paled at the destruction. "Who would do such a thing?" "Cutter," Ezekiel growled. "His work, sure as sunrise." They spent hours tracking the goats through deep snow, finally finding most huddled in a ravine. 2 were missing, likely fallen prey to wolves. Clara wept as she counted the survivors, while Bess whispered prayers of thanks for those they'd saved. Back at the cabin, Ezekiel paced like a caged bear. "This is just the start," he warned. "Cutter won't stop until he drives us off." His words proved true. Over the next week, more damage appeared. Water barrels frozen solid after being overturned in the night. Firewood scattered down the slope. Trap lines cut and ruined. Each morning brought fresh evidence of malice. The sisters grew fearful, jumping at every night sound. Clara took to sleeping with a knife beside her bed, though her hand trembled at the thought of using it. Bess sang hymns more frequently, as if to ward off evil with praise. Then came the morning they found their storage shed broken into, winter provisions destroyed. Flour scattered in the snow, precious jars of preserved food smashed. Ezekiel stood amid the wreckage, his hands clenched into fists. "Enough," he said, voice deadly quiet. Time to end this. He saddled his horse despite Clara's protests. Ezekiel, please. Violence won't solve this. But rage burned in his eyes, the war-hardened soldier emerging from beneath the peaceful farmer. He rode toward town with vengeance in his heart, leaving the sisters wringing their hands in worry. In town, Ezekiel found Cutter at the saloon, surrounded by rough men who'd clearly been paid for their nighttime mischief. The railroad agent smiled coldly as Ezekiel burst through the doors. Well, if it ain't the mountain man, Cutter drawled. Having trouble with your property? Ezekiel's fists rose, years of combat training tensing his muscles. The saloon fell silent, men stepping back from the brewing storm. But before violence could erupt, a familiar voice rang out. Ezekiel, stop! Clara stood in the doorway, Bess beside her. They'd followed him to town, refusing to let him face this alone. Clara stepped forward, her usual shyness overcome by desperate concern. Don't let him turn you back into a man of violence, she pleaded. Remember what you told us about the war? How it ate at your soul? Ezekiel's hands trembled, caught between rage and conscience. Bess added her voice. The Lord says vengeance is his. We must show mercy, even to enemies. Mercy? Cutter sneered. Listen to your fat wives preach, mountain man. Shows how weak you've become. Ezekiel's face darkened, but Clara touched his arm. Your strength isn't in your fists anymore, she said softly. It's in your heart, in choosing right over easy. Long seconds passed as Ezekiel struggled internally. Finally, his fists lowered. Instead of striking, he pulled out the judge's ruling on their land claim. Sheriff, he called, I want to report crimes against legal property. Sheriff Wilkins stepped forward from the crowd. He'd witnessed everything, and something in the sister's words had stirred his conscience. He took the papers, reading them carefully. These attacks on your homestead, he said. You have proof it was Cutter's doing? Got witnesses, Ezekiel replied. Men who will testify they were paid to cause trouble, and boot prints matching his fancy town shoes. Cutter's smirk faded as several men shifted uncomfortably. Honor among thieves proved thin when faced with the law's scrutiny. The sheriff nodded slowly. Mr. Cutter, seems you've been violating a legal ruling. That's serious business. You can't prove anything, Cutter blustered, but his voice held fear. Actually, I can. The sheriff's voice hardened. Got reports of you hiring men for night work. Got witnesses to your threats. And now I've seen you trying to provoke violence in my town. He turned to his deputy. Bring the judge, this needs settling proper. The next hour passed in tense waiting. When the judge arrived, evidence was presented. The legal ruling, witness statements, even Cutter's distinctive boot prints drawn in a notebook. The judge listened gravely, his face growing sterner with each detail. Mr. Cutter, he finally declared, you've shown contempt for this court's ruling and engineered criminal mischief. I'm fining you $100 for damages. He raised his hand as Cutter started to protest. Furthermore, you're ordered to leave this territory within 48 hours. Your employment with the railroad is hereby terminated. Cutter's face twisted with fury. He spat at Ezekiel's feet. You'll regret this, all of you. Only warning you'll get, the sheriff said quietly. Leave peaceful or leave in chains. The railroad agent glared at them all, hatred burning in his eyes. But faced with the law's full weight, he had no choice. Grabbing his hat, he stormed out of the saloon. As the crowd dispersed, Clara sagged with relief. Thank you, she whispered to Ezekiel, for choosing a better way. That evening, back at their cabin, they sat close by the fire. The goats had been rounded up, fences mended, and peace restored. But something deeper had changed. A victory won not by force, but by faith. You saved more than our land today, Ezekiel said quietly to Clara. When I raised my fists, I felt the war coming back. The killing, the hatred. You stopped me from becoming that man again. God stopped you, Clara corrected gently. We just reminded you of his way. Ezekiel nodded slowly. Reckon you saved my soul along with my hand. He looked at both sisters with deep gratitude. The Lord knew what he was doing, sending you to me. Taught me mercy's stronger than meanness every time. Outside, winter stars glittered in the cold sky, but inside their cabin, warmth and love wrapped around them like a quilt, stronger than any storm, deeper than any darkness. They had faced evil with good, and good had prevailed. Their home was safe at last, protected not by force of arms but by force of faith. Spring arrived early that year, melting snow into rivulets that carved paths down the mountainside. As the land awakened, so did new dreams in the hearts of Ezekiel Boone and his adopted family. The small line shack that had sheltered them through winter now seemed to burst at the seams with their shared life and growing hopes. One morning, as dawn painted the sky in soft pinks and golds, Ezekiel stood beside Clara at the edge of the clearing. His weathered hand sketched shapes in the air, pointing out where new walls might rise. "Reckon we could build here," he said, boots crunching on the last patches of snow. "Good flat ground, catches the morning sun, big enough for a proper house." Clara nodded, her practical mind already planning. "We'll need a larger kitchen, and windows, real glass ones this time." She paused, uncertain. "That is, if you're sure about investing so much." Ezekiel's face softened as he looked at her. "This ain't just shelter anymore, Clara. It's home. Our home." Inside the cabin, Bess sat at the rough-hewn table, papers spread before her. She'd been writing out lessons, dreaming of children gathered around to learn their letters and numbers. The idea of a schoolhouse had taken root in her heart over the winter months. "Even the smallest light drives back darkness," she murmured, remembering her mother's words. Teaching had always been her secret wish, though few had ever taken her seriously before. The sound of horses approaching drew them all outside. To their surprise, William Tucker, their nearest neighbor, rode up with his 2 sons and a wagon loaded with fresh-cut logs. "Heard tell you're aiming to build," Tucker called out, grinning. "Thought we might lend a hand." More wagons appeared through the trees. The Peterson family brought tools and rope. The widow Mackenzie arrived with her grown sons, carrying baskets of food. Even the sheriff rode up, leading a mule loaded with window glass ordered from Denver. Clara's eyes filled with tears at the sight. These same people who had once whispered and pointed now stood ready to help, their faces friendly and open. She hurried to start coffee brewing while Bess set out plates for what would become an impromptu feast. Work began immediately. Men marked foundation lines and began clearing ground. Women organized a cooking station, keeping workers fed with steady streams of biscuits and stew. Children ran errands, carrying tools and water. Ezekiel found himself directing operations, his military experience useful in coordinating the many willing hands. He watched in amazement as walls began to rise, sturdy logs notched and fitted with care. The sound of axes and saws filled the air, punctuated by laughter and calls for help. "Never thought I'd see the day," Tucker commented during a break. "Town's changed since you folks came. Showed us what real strength looks like." Clara moved among the workers, making sure everyone had food and drink. Her size, once a source of mockery, now seemed to match her generous heart. Women who had once avoided her now sought her recipes and advice. "Your bread's a miracle," Widow Mackenzie declared, helping to serve. "You must teach us your secret." "No secret," Clara replied, smiling. "Just patience and practice." Near the edge of the clearing, Bess had gathered the younger children. While their parents worked, she kept them entertained with stories and simple lessons. Their eager faces and quick minds strengthened her resolve. "Miss Bess," little Sarah Peterson piped up, "Ma says you're going to build a school. Will you be our teacher?" Bess's heart swelled. "If the Lord wills it, child. First we need to finish this house." The work continued through the week. What might have taken months alone was accomplished through shared effort. The new cabin took shape, 2 stories high, with real glass windows and a proper stone chimney. Clara's kitchen had ample space for cooking and preserving, with shelves for her growing collection of crocks and jars. One evening, as sunset painted the new walls golden, the community gathered for supper. Tables were set outside, laden with food brought by every family. Children played tag between the trees while adults sat talking and laughing together. Ezekiel stood to say grace, his deep voice carrying across the clearing. "Lord," he began, then paused, overcome. Clara reached up to squeeze his hand, lending strength. "Lord," he continued, "we thank you not just for this food, but for the miracle of family restored. Not just our little family here, but this whole community. You've shown us that your love can turn strangers into neighbors and neighbors into kin." "Amen," voices echoed, and Bess's clear soprano led them in a hymn of thanksgiving. As darkness fell and lanterns were lit, people lingered, reluctant to end this day of celebration. Plans were made for future gatherings. The Petersons offered lumber for the schoolhouse. Widow Mackenzie volunteered to teach sewing alongside Bess's lessons. "Might need to build that schoolhouse bigger than planned," Tucker observed, watching the children play. "Word's spreading about this place. Folks are saying it's what a community should be." Clara looked around at the faces illuminated by lamplight, faces that had once held scorn, now showing friendship and respect. She remembered their first terrifying day on the auction platform, and how far they had come. "The Lord does work in mysterious ways," she murmured. "Not so mysterious," Ezekiel replied softly. "He knew what he was about, bringing us together. Sometimes the strongest foundations are built from broken pieces." Inside their new home, the hearth glowed warm and welcoming. The larger rooms would soon fill with the sounds of daily life. Boots on floorboards, kettles singing, prayers and laughter mingling in the air. But more than that, they would fill with love, the kind that transforms a house into a home and strangers into family. As the evening drew to a close, neighbors departed with waves and calls of "God bless." Ezekiel, Clara, and Bess stood in the doorway of their new cabin, watching the lanterns bobbing away through the trees. Their hearts were full with the miracle of acceptance of community restored. "This is just the beginning," Bess said softly, her eyes bright with dreams of the schoolhouse to come. Clara nodded, feeling the truth of it deep in her soul. They had built more than walls and roof today. They had built bridges between hearts, proving that faith, hard work, and love could overcome any barrier. Ezekiel's strong arm encircled them both as they stood in the doorway of their new home. The mountain air carried the scent of pine and possibility, and the stars above seemed to shine with special brightness as if reflecting the joy in their hearts. The mountain streams rushed with melting snow, their song heralding spring's arrival. Morning sunlight spilled across the ridge where Clara knelt in fresh-turned earth, her strong hands working the soil. All around her, tiny green shoots pushed through dark loam, promises of the harvest to come. "Lord willing, we'll have fresh vegetables by summer," she called to Bess, who stood at the newly built fence watching 3 newborn kids wobble on spindly legs. "These little ones should be giving milk by then," Bess replied, reaching down to scratch behind a kid's ears. The tiny goat pressed against her skirts, bleating softly. "Sweet thing knows who feeds them." The sisters exchanged warm glances, remembering how far they'd come since those dark days of autumn. Clara's illness had left her weak for months, but spring's warmth seemed to restore her strength daily. Her cheeks were rosy now as she planted row after row of seeds, carrots, beans, and peas. From the far side of the clearing came the steady rhythm of hammering. Ezekiel and 5 neighboring men worked on raising the barn's frame, their shirt sleeves rolled up in the morning warmth. The structure was already taking shape, its beams reaching toward the Colorado sky. "Pass up that crossbeam, Tucker," Ezekiel called from the rafters. William Tucker and his sons heaved the heavy timber upward. The men moved with practiced coordination, months of working together having forged an easy friendship. "Reckon this'll be the finest barn in the territory," Tucker said, wiping his brow. "Might have to build myself one just like it." "You're welcome to try," Ezekiel grinned, "long as you bring your wife's apple pies as payment." Their laughter carried across the clearing to where Clara worked. She smiled, remembering how these same men had once stood silent at the auction block, watching her shame. Now they shared meals at her table and sought her counsel on preserving food for winter. Near midday, more wagons arrived bringing supplies and helping hands. The widow Mackenzie's daughters rushed to help Clara in the garden, while their brothers joined the barn raising. Children darted between workers carrying water and tools, their young voices bright with excitement. "Miss Bess!" little Sarah Peterson called, running up to the goat pen. "Ma says to tell you we're setting up dinner by the big oak." She peered through the fence at the kids. "Oh, they're so sweet. Can I help feed them?" "Of course, child." Bess helped Sarah measure out grain, watching the girls' careful movements. "You've got a gentle touch. That's important with young animals." By afternoon, the garden showed neat rows of planted seeds, each marked with careful stakes. The barn's skeleton rose tall against the spring sky, ready for siding. Women spread quilts under the oak tree, laying out a feast of chicken, biscuits, and early spring greens. As the sun began its westward slide, workers gathered to eat. Clara's fresh bread disappeared quickly, accompanied by praise that made her blush with pleasure. Children played tag around the adults, their laughter mixing with the sound of rushing streams and evening birdsong. "Best save some energy for tomorrow," Ezekiel reminded them all. "It's the Lord's day." Sunday dawned clear and bright. The family rode their wagon into town, now well-sprung and pulled by 2 healthy mules instead of 1 tired one. Clara wore a new dress she'd sewn herself, while Bess had fashioned a pretty bonnet from carefully saved fabric. The little church was filled to bursting, sunlight streaming through its simple windows. The sisters sat tall in their pew, no longer shrinking from stares. Children waved to them from nearby seats, parents nodding in warm greeting. When the preacher rose to speak, his eyes swept the congregation before settling on their family. "Today, I want to speak about God's power to redeem and restore," he began. "We've seen it here among us, in how he can take what the world scorns and reveal its true worth." Clara felt tears well up as the preacher continued, describing their journey from outcasts to beloved neighbors. Beside her, Bess squeezed her hand while Ezekiel sat straight and proud, his Bible open on his knee. "Through their testimony of faith," the preacher declared, "we've all learned what it means to be God's family. They've shown us that true strength isn't in appearance or position, but in character and faith." After the service, congregants lingered in the spring sunshine. Children who had once taunted now crowded around Clara and Bess, begging for stories and treats. Several girls had brought their dolls to show Bess, while boys peppered Clara with questions about her garden. "You've got quite a following," Tucker observed to Ezekiel as they watched the scene. "Never thought I'd see it," Ezekiel replied softly. "Was a time I couldn't imagine being part of any community again, let alone this." The afternoon passed in visiting and sharing news. Plans were made for spring plantings and summer gatherings. The sisters found themselves at the center of discussions about preserving food and caring for livestock, their knowledge sought and valued. As evening approached, the family headed home. Their wagon wound up the familiar trail, now marked with fresh wagon ruts from frequent visitors. The setting sun painted the mountains gold and purple, while frogs began their evening chorus in the meadow. Inside their home, lamplight made the windows glow warmly. Clara stirred the stew she'd left simmering, while Bess set their table, no longer the rough plank of their first days, but a properly made piece crafted by Ezekiel's own hands. They ate together as they always did, heads bowed in prayer first. Through the open window came the sound of spring peepers, their song rising and falling like nature's own hymn of praise. "Strange to think," Clara mused, passing the cornbread, "how what we once thought was the worst day of our lives turned out to be God's mercy in disguise." "Ain't that the truth?" Ezekiel agreed. "Was running from people back then. Now look at us. Can't hardly get a moment's peace for all the visitors." Bess smiled, remembering how she'd once tried to make herself invisible. "The Lord does work in mysterious ways," she said. "Who would have thought we'd find not just shelter, but true belonging?" After supper, they sat by the hearth, though the spring evening was mild. It was their custom now, this quiet time of reflection. The fire's warmth mingled with the fresh breeze through open windows, while night sounds drifted in from the meadow. Peace settled over them like a familiar quilt, not the desperate peace of escape, nor the fragile peace of initial acceptance, but the deep peace of knowing they were exactly where they belonged. Clara's hands were busy with mending. Bess hummed softly as she worked on lesson plans, and Ezekiel whittled a new spindle for the spinning wheel. Outside, the frogs sang their ancient songs to the stars, and all was well. Golden evening light painted the mountainsides as summer's warmth lingered in the Colorado air. The new cabin stood proudly against the backdrop of pines, its sturdy walls and fresh-cut boards a testament to months of dedicated work. Smoke curled lazily from the stone chimney, carrying the sweet scent of pine and cedar into the twilight sky. Through the open windows, lamplight spilled onto the packed earth of the yard, creating warm pools of amber that stretched toward the garden. Inside, the evening meal's dishes had been cleared away, the table wiped clean, and the day's work was done. Clara had arranged 3 wooden chairs on the wide front porch, proper chairs now, not the rough-hewn logs of their first days. Ezekiel settled into his seat, the wood creaking softly beneath him. The sisters joined him, one on either side, their skirts rustling as they sat. Together they watched the sun begin its nightly descent behind the mountains, painting the clouds in brilliant shades of pink and gold. In the nearby corral, goats grazed contentedly, their bells tinkling softly as they moved. The herd had grown since those early days, providing milk and cheese enough to share with neighbors. Beyond the fence, wildflowers dotted the meadow where children played, their laughter carrying on the evening breeze. "Sarah, mind you don't tear your dress," Clara called out to the Peterson girl, who was leading a group of children in a game of tag. The children's voices echoed back, sweet and clear in the mountain air. "Remember when no children would come near our place?" Bess asked softly, smoothing her apron. "Now we can hardly keep them away." Clara smiled, watching the young ones play. "The Lord does have a way of changing hearts," she said, "even those that seemed hardest." Ezekiel shifted in his chair, his weathered hands resting on his knees. The same hands that had once known only war and loneliness now built homes, tended gardens, and gathered children close. He looked at the sisters, Clara, strong and capable, her health fully restored. Bess, gentle and wise, teaching the valley's children their letters and numbers. "I had nothing left," he said, his deep voice thick with emotion. "After the war, after losing Mary and the baby, I reckoned I'd live and die alone in that old line shack." He paused, clearing his throat. "But God had other plans. He gave me more than I ever thought to ask for. He gave me a home." Slowly, deliberately, he lifted his hands and placed them on the sisters' shoulders. The gesture held all the weight of their shared journey, from that desperate auction block to this peaceful evening. Clara leaned against him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "He gave us all a home," she whispered. "Not just shelter, but true belonging." The evening breeze carried the scent of Clara's herb garden and the sweet grass of the meadow. In the distance, a whippoorwill began its evening song, its call echoing across the valley. The first stars were beginning to appear in the deepening blue of the sky. Bess straightened in her chair, her clear voice lifting in song. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound, that saved a wretch like me." Clara joined in, her alto harmonizing perfectly with her sister's soprano. After a moment, Ezekiel's deep baritone added its strength to their melody. The 3 voices rose together, carrying the familiar hymn into the twilight air. "I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see." Their song drifted across the valley, touching the hearts of those who heard. The playing children grew quiet, listening. Even the goats seemed to pause in their grazing, bells silent for a moment. As the final notes faded into the gathering dusk, more stars appeared overhead, twinkling like diamonds scattered across heaven's floor. The mountain peaks stood dark against the sky, silent guardians of the peace that had finally, permanently, settled over their home. From the meadow came the soft sound of children singing, picking up where the family had left off. Their young voices carried the hymn back to the porch, a sweet echo of faith passed on to the next generation. Clara reached over and took Bess's hand, completing the circle of their family. Together they sat, watching night settle over their mountain home, their hearts full of the quiet joy that comes with knowing you are exactly where God meant you to be. The lamplight from their windows grew brighter as darkness deepened, casting its welcoming glow across the yard. Inside, the cabin waited warm and secure, no longer a rough shelter, but a true home built on love, strengthened by faith and filled with unshakable hope. Stars continued to appear in the darkening sky, each one a reminder of God's promises kept. The whippoorwill sang on, crickets added their evening chorus, and peace reigned over the mountain as complete as the stars above. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.